Currently Inked, episode number 24 for December 4th, 2016 is brought to you by Karas Customs at karascustoms.com. Hello, pen fans. Welcome to another episode of Currently Inked here on The Pen Habit. My name's Matt Armstrong. Glad to have you here for another question and answer session. So, not a lot's been going on in Penland this week for me. I haven't really gotten any orders. I do have some exciting news. I'll tease it a little bit here and then give you more details in just a little bit. But thanks to you wonderful folks, I've had a couple of retailers in Europe reach out to me about picking up the Inky Fingers notebook line. So before too long, I hope to be able to announce that Inky Fingers notebooks will be available in the EU and the UK, hopefully. So that's exciting for those people who have wanted to get the notebooks, but who have not been able to because of the shipping costs of just ordering a couple. So that's exciting. More information as that comes along. But in terms of pens, I've been trying to write everything dry. I've only got about 4 pens inked right now. I've got a bunch of reviews that I've got to get edited together. So I haven't been inking up a bunch of pens, so I don't have a lot to show you for Currently Inked. So this episode, I thought I would go back and do some re-reviews of some of my older pens just to kind of give you an idea of how things have updated since then. So before we dive into that, let's do some questions first, and I've got a bunch of them today. So this first one comes from Ritzert in the Netherlands, who says, "What do you do with all your leftover, never to be used anymore bottles of still good ink?" So talked a little bit about this in the previous episode, but a couple things. You can, obviously flush it down the toilet or pour it down the sink if you want. One thing I would recommend doing is giving it to a new fountain pen user who's just getting started in the hobby, really wants to try a bunch of different inks. So things like the Trade Channel, got a little note here on my my tablet there. Things like the Reddit Fountain Pens channel or the Trade Channel on the Pen Addict Slack. Those things are great places where you could see if anyone wants your bottles of ink. Basically just ask them to pay for shipping and you'll send it to them for free or whatever. The other thing someone mentioned to me in an email that you could try doing is actually try mixing inks. So I don't do this. I don't really feel the need to. I've got enough inks as it is. But if you want to play around with trying to generate specific colors that you can't find or things like that, you might want to look at trying to mix some inks. So using Brian Goulet's methodology that he talks about in his videos, I would use something like a little sample vial, mix a couple different colors together, let it sit for an hour or two or maybe a day just to make sure it doesn't congeal or get any weird particulates or explode or anything like that. And then once you're sure it's safe, put it in a cheap pen to try it out. And if it all goes well, you might have discovered a new color that you really like. So that's another fun thing you can do. What I wouldn't do though is mix it in the pen or mix huge quantities in case you hate the color. So do little batches at a time. Follow the scientific method, little experiments, little changes, change one variable at a time, and you might end up finding some inks that you really like that way. The next question comes from Nick in Iowa, who asks, "Have you ever tried using a Namiki pen, and what are your thoughts on the huge Namiki Emperor and its insanely massive nib? Do you ever plan to get one?" So the only Namiki pen I've ever tried it was back when the Pilot Falcon was released under the Namiki brand. The one I bought was actually technically a Namiki Falcon. They moved that under the Pilot brand and reserved the Namiki name for the much higher end pens. My thoughts on them are there's some really beautiful pens there. I don't own any Maki-e pens. And for those who aren't familiar, Maki-e is the technique of basically doing paintings with translucent powders and lacquers and things like that to get really beautiful figurines or figures on the pen. There are a lot of Maki-e creations out there. Some of them are a little bit more factory made. They're still done by hand, but it's identical designs, that sort of thing, where others are very, one piece work of art kind of things. I don't own any Maki-e in my collection at all. It's something I would probably like to own, but not simply for the sake of owning it. Now, the Namiki Emperor is a gargantuan pen. I've never used one in person, and that's one of those pens where I would have to try it in person before I would want to buy it. Not to say that it wouldn't be worth it, but they're very, very expensive. And as much as I think it would be cool to have a showy pen like that, I'm not sure how much I would enjoy using it, and certainly not how much I would enjoy using it based on the price. So that's something where I would have to try it first, and then I would have to find a design that really speaks to me to justify that cost. So will I get one? I'm not saying no, I'm just saying it's probably unlikely without at least some additional research and opportunities to use them. So, maybe if Stephen Brown ever comes to a pen show here in the US, he can let me try his Namiki Emperor and I'll see if I like it or not. So there you go. Ava from Marietta, Georgia asks, I recall you mentioning you have a custom order placed for a pen of a specific vintage discontinued material, and that got me thinking. And I do, in fact, I've got a Scriptorium pens order in for some old Conway Stewart. I'm not sure I'd call it vintage, but it certainly has been discontinued. A material called Evergreen. Leigh Reyes had a pen made out of this evergreen material, and I fell in love with it, and I emailed Renee and said, do you have any left? And she said, yes, I do. And I said, reserve it for me. So I am just waiting to get up on her list, and then I'm going to get a pen made out of Conway Stewart Evergreen, and I'm super excited about it. But Ava goes on to ask, what's your favorite fountain pen material, be it for look, feel, or some other aspect? I know favorites are tough in this hobby, and yes, they are, so feel free to just list some of the top ones. So if I were just listing some of the top ones, they would include most of the plastics, casein, celluloid, acrylic, resin. Those tend to be my favorite materials kind of across the board. I don't love most metal pens. I'm starting to come around on the metal pen just a little bit, and I found a few that I really like. And materials like the lava resin, or the resin-infused lava rock that my Visconti Homo sapiens Bronze Age is made out of, is cool, but I tend to like more colorful pens, and I like the lightness of plastics. So my favorite, absolute all-time favorite material is the diffusion bonded acrylic for the classic pens line, the LB5 and the LM1, the LB3. I just love that material. I think it is gorgeous beyond definition. It feels nice in the hand. From what I've talked to with Andy Lambro, it is one of the most robust plastics being manufactured for pens today. So that's my favorite individual material. If I had to go with a favorite family of materials, though, I would absolutely pick celluloid. Everything from that kind of camphor, Vicks VapoRub type smell to the feel in the hand, the rich colors, the neat designs and materials, things like the brown Arco that Omas used to make. So that's really my if I had to pick one material, that's it. Now I know celluloid is not the most robust of materials, and it can be a little, flammable, but I would say that is my favorite for the way it feels. And the way it looks. Now, I love the way ebonite feels. I am generally not super in love with the look of ebonite. There are some ebonites I like, but most of the time, that two-color ripple, it's cool looking, but it doesn't. I don't lose myself in that material the way I would lose myself in a really rich, deep celluloid. So that's kind of my personal preference, but I'm sure other people have their own preferences too, and they'll leave comments about their favorite materials down in the section below. Oh, other neat materials. Macrolon, which is that fiberglass infused resin that is used in the Lamy 2000, and a similar material in the Tactile Turn Gist. That's a neat material too. I like that material a lot. The re-review of pens today is going to be a little different. I'm going to have to rely on just photos for the most part, because I don't have any of the pens that I am re-reviewing today still in my collection. Not to say they're bad pens, for the most part. I just don't have them in my collection anymore. So the first one we'll talk about is the Faber-Castell black, this is always a tongue twister for me. The Faber-Castell Basic Black Leather. Basic Black Leather, Basic Black Leather, Basic Black Leather. Say that 5 times fast. Okay, so the Basic Black Leather is around a $50 pen in the basic is around $50. I think the black leather's a little bit more expensive. I think I paid $65 or something for it. It was a long time ago. And it's one of Faber-Castell's kind of entry-level pens. It was a beautiful writer. I liked the way it wrote a lot. I was not a fan of the way it looked. So the leather on the body was cool. I actually really liked that. The section was made of this kind of rubberized material. It was perfectly cylindrical, so it didn't have that concave feel to it that I like when I'm gripping my pen, nor was it convex, kind of a, cushy quality. So it was rubberized, which was a nice grip, but it was perfectly cylindrical, which I find not very ergonomic for the way I hold a pen. The part that I hated about the pen, though, was the cap. The cap was made of plastic. It was this bulbous thing with a weird cutout on the top, and I just did not care for the cap at all. So I ended up getting rid of the pen. I don't really miss it. It was a great pen, great writer. I'm sure it went to a good home, and the person who has it really liked it. But from a visual perspective, it just wasn't the right fit for me. So that's why it left my collection. So that is re-review number 1. And we'll hit a couple more before this episode is over. But I think now is a really good time to talk about the sponsor for this episode. So I did a review a while back of pens by Karas Kustoms, KARASKUSTOMS, at karaskustoms.com. I did a review of their ink fountain pen. Now, Karas Kustoms is based in Mesa, Arizona. I actually lived a few blocks away from where their shop is located many moons ago, and I don't think they were there at the time when I was there, but if they were, I didn't know they were there. And they, a few years ago, they kind of burst onto the scene making pens out of machined metal. So most of their pens were made out of aluminum or copper or brass initially. And then they started anodizing some of the aluminum pens, and they've started trying different materials like Delrin, or I think it's called phenolic or something like that. Which is the, micarta, I think is the other term that it gets thrown around a lot. So they've started incorporating other materials, other designs, and they've started doing some new models, including the Render K, which can be either a fountain pen or a ballpoint, which you just swap out the section, swap a new section in, you've got a different pen. It's neat for those of us who need to straddle the line between ballpoint and fountain pen, depending on the time of day and where you're located and all that kind of stuff. So they've been around for a few years. They are quite well respected. They've got really high quality manufacturing, some very unique designs, unique colors, unique materials. They use really high quality nibs. And if you're looking for a pen with some heft, with a little bit more oomph to it, and something that's very different than anything else that's out there, you might want to take a look at Karas Kustoms. So you can purchase all of Karas Kustoms pens through their website at karaskustoms.com. It's KARASKUSTOMS.com, or through several retailers. A lot of retailers are carrying their pens now. That's also very cool. If you order directly from the website, you do get a little bit more selection in terms of what's available and color combinations and that sort of thing. But you can, if you've got a favorite retailer you like to look through, check to see if they carry Karas Kustoms pens. If you do order from the Karas Kustoms website, use the coupon code KARASPENS, KARASPENS, all caps, all one word, through the rest of 2016 to get 10% off your order. So thank you so much to the folks at Karas Kustoms, whom I've gotten to know at some of the fountain pen shows over the last couple years. Good guys, and really serious about being involved in the community. So it's glad to have them on board. This is the first time they've sponsored anything here on the Pen Habit. So if you're looking for a pen for the holidays, want 10% off, head over to karaskustoms.com, use the coupon code KARASPENS. Thank you so much to them for supporting the Pen Habit, and if you do order, thank them as well. So thank you so much, guys. Okay, this next question comes from Phil in Albany, Georgia, who asks, I love the red sheen that Private Reserve Electric DC Blue gives off. What are some other inks that produce a nice sheen? So if you like Electric DC Blue, don't forget to check out DC Super Show Blue, also from Private Reserve. That has, I think it sheens even better than Electric DC Blue does. I like the color a little bit more. Other blues in that same kind of family that do really well, I'm thinking of Diamine Majestic Blue, which is going to be a little bit darker, and Ackerman No. 5 Shocking Blue. Both of those have a pretty strong sheen as well. Most of the inks from Robert Oster are pretty heavily sheening. There's a new one that's, I believe, an exclusive to Van Ness pens called Fire and Ice. It's a dark teal color with a wicked red sheen on it. Another one kind of in that same teal family is Emerald of Chivor by J. Urban. That also incorporates the gold particulate, so if you don't like glitter inks, that might not be the right choice for you, but it has a really neat, it's teal with a really neat red sheen and then gold on top of it. So it's one of the most eye-catching inks I've ever seen. Turquoises or lighter blues, I think Iroshizuku Konpeki is a great one, as is Pelikan Edelstein Topaz. Both of those have a really neat sheen to them. If you're looking for something completely different, something more in the red family, check out Iroshizuku Yamabudo, which is, I think it's wild grapes. It's kind of a reddish purple with a really strong gold sheen. Another purple that does really, really well is Cross Violet. I've got a bottle of that over there, and it's pretty easily available. Also, the Lamy Dark Lilac, which is just over my shoulder there. That's hard to find. It was the special edition ink of 2016, and it's not readily available anymore, but if you can find it, it's got a really neat sheen. And Sailor Okuyama, which is a pomegranate colored ink with another wicked gold sheen. Those are some of the most highly sheening inks I know of. Just trying to think if there are any others that strike me. Green is a color I don't see a lot of sheen in most green inks. I do see some sheen in the Parker Penman Emerald, but this has been discontinued for years, so it's really hard to find. Trying to think, any other inks that sheen? Oh, this is not its original bottle, because the original bottle didn't spring a leak, but it got covered. This is the Sailor Bung Box Sapphire, and it is a gorgeous ink. This is probably my favorite blue, period, and it's got a really nice sheen to it as well. But it's quite an expensive ink. I switched it over to that old Graf von Faber-Castell bottle because those Sailor bottles are awful to fill from if you've got a pen with a big nib. So that's why it's in the wrong bottle. All right, next question from Sudhir in Mumbai, India. Sudhir says, my question is about Indian pens. I know you have reviewed a couple, but the reason I ask this question is, we are a group of fountain pen enthusiasts in India who constantly argue about how pens made in India are or should be. Some of us love them blindly, others hate them equally blindly. We would love to hear a neutral third-party view on this issue. Thanks again, and please continue the great work. Well, first of all, thank you, Sudhir. And thank you for thinking that I am, in any way, shape, or form, a neutral third party. So, Indian pens fit a very interesting niche in the fountain pen market, in the modern fountain pen market. And I feel like they're kind of broken up into two categories. One is the super, super inexpensive category, very mass-produced, very poor quality, terrible nibs. And there are some of those out there, and I feel like those are the pens that a lot of time kids in India are given to when they learn how to write. I've got several Indian friends and coworkers because I work in the tech industry in Seattle, so we've got a huge Indian community here. And a lot of them, when they see me pull out a fountain pen, go, "Oh, I hate fountain pens. I had to use a fountain pen." And I ask them, "Do you know which one you used?" And oftentimes they say, "Oh, it's just some cheap, couple dollar kind of thing." And I think that those are being created. They probably shouldn't even be used, though. I think those pens, pretty much across the board, are not worth the cost of the plastic it took to make them. There's this middle tier of Indian fountain pens that I like a lot more, and these are the made in small quantities by a very small pen shop, or even just one individual maker, usually out of ebonite or acrylics, hand-turned. I'm thinking of Asa pens or Gamma pens or Ranga. So those, I think, they're a lot more interesting from a perspective of fountain pens in general. I feel like I've only had maybe one Indian-made nib that was worth anything, in my opinion. So the Indian pens I like the most are the ones that are actually using German nibs. And in those cases, I like the pens a lot more. I will say that I feel like the fit and finish on a lot of these pens, there's a gap between the mass production of quality pens and what's being done right now. And if that gap can be bridged, if Indian pen makers can get to a point where they can produce large quantities, but produce large quantities with really, really high quality materials and high quality manufacturing, I don't feel like that really exists from Indian-made pens right now. If they can figure out how to do it, I think that could completely change the fountain pen market right now. These small pens are really nice and well made. I would say that the fit and finish, even on these small manufacturers, are often not quite as nice as you might get from a custom maker elsewhere, because it's this weird in between. It's not really a custom pen. It's not really a one-off request. It's semi-mass production, and so the attention to quality control maybe isn't as high, but it's not mass produced either. It's this weird in between thing. So in general, I am interested to see where fountain pens from India go over the next few years, especially as the fountain pen community continues to grow. But I think there's going to have to be some interesting direction taken by the manufacturers there. Either they're going to have to learn how to mass produce high quality instruments, or they're always going to be a little obscure in the fountain pen community in general. I feel like there are some manufacturers, and I'm not going to name names necessarily, who are starting to put together higher quality pens, and I'm excited to see that and see how it goes, especially some of the partnerships I'm seeing with retailers here in the US or in Europe and the manufacturers in India. So I'm really interested to see where it goes over the next few years. But at the same time, my big thing is, if it's super cheap, I'm probably not going to buy it, just because I haven't had good experience with the quality on super inexpensive pens there from India. The next question comes from Daniel in Palouse, in the hills of the Palouse in Washington State. Beautiful area. I drive through it every now and again on my way home to my parents' house. And Daniel asks, what engraved designs on nibs do you find the most attractive? Does this factor into your choice of buying a pen? For example, I do not like cross nibs, but I find the engraving on the Cross Townsend to be very beautiful. I almost want to purchase the pen just for the nib. I think my favorite engraving, it's probably not engraved so much as it is stamped into the face of the nib, is the design of the Pelikan nibs, especially the M800 and the M1000. That intricate kind of clover-shaped swooping double line thing where the ink kind of travels around in the channels and will just glow in the right light, I think is one of the most beautiful nib designs currently on the market. Montblanc also has a really beautiful several beautiful nib designs on their pens. I'm trying to think. I have a Danny Trio I like quite a bit. The nib on my Wahl Eversharp Superflex is very, very cool looking, but it's also functional because they laser etched part of the metal away to make it more flexible. And it holds the ink on the face of the nib and kind of colors it, which is kind of cool looking based on the look you're going for. So I think those are some of my favorite designs. Does the design of the nib purchase influence my decision to purchase? I honestly have to say, not even a little bit, really. I don't care that much about the design on the nib. I care about how the nib writes and how it feels when it's writing, but the design of the nib itself, I think pretty much the only time it would influence me is if the color of the nib would push me away from buying the pen. So, for instance, it's a pen with silver hardware, but it's got a gold nib on it. That I might say, I don't really want that, or I'll hold out, or I'll buy it, but I'm going to replace the nib. So for the most part, the design of the nib doesn't really hold a lot of interest to me. When I find one I like, it's just like a bonus. And I take the cap off my Pelikan M800 and just sit there and look at it with a dopey grin on my face. That's a little bit more how the design of the nib impacts what I do. Okay, let's take a look at another pen here. Another re-review. We talked about it briefly a little bit earlier in this episode. The Namiki/Pilot Falcon. So this is a real well-known pen if you're into the community. It's been around for several years. It's got that weird kind of bird-shaped nib on it, and it's a soft nib, so it's got a little bit of give to the tines. I've reviewed the pen once, had a very bad experience with the pen, re-reviewed the pen a couple years later. The experience was better, but I still didn't really like the pen. And in the end, I just don't think it's a right fit for me. A couple big problems. One, I think the Falcon can't help but be a disappointment, at least a little bit, because even the videos, my video included, show the tines flexing a lot, and it's just not meant to do that. This is not a pen where you really should be flexing the tines at all. That's not what it was designed for. It's a soft nib, it's nice and bouncy, but I had a lot of ink flow issues. Either it was way too wet or not enough ink at all. It was I don't like the converters. The feel in the hand was wrong for me. It was just the wrong size and the wrong shape. So, clearly I got rid of my first one. I did a lot of work on the nib and I got it writing, and then I sold it to someone. The second one that I re-reviewed was loaned to me, and it changed my attitude a little bit, but not a lot. And so in the end, I'm just not a big fan of the Falcon. And this is the acrylic version, not the metal version. So that's kind of where I stand on that pen now. I know a lot of people still really like it. It's just not the right one for me. So I don't have one in my collection anymore. Okay, the next question comes from Michael in San Diego, and this is actually a really apropos question based on the discussion we just had about the Pilot Falcon. So he says, I had a quick question regarding how pen reviewers test out their pens. I noticed that they'll test the flex of even the most rigid nib by pressing down more than the nib is supposed to handle. This is, of course, educational for the viewer, but wouldn't this misalign some of those rigid nibs? Do you inspect the nib after a flex test, or does the one-time flex not harm the nib at all? And this is such a good question, and it's so hard to answer thoroughly in a video like this. So I'll approach it from my point of view, first as a consumer of reviews when I got started, and then as a reviewer myself and how that opinion has changed over time. So when I first got into watching fountain pen reviews, I went through review after review after review, and people kept talking about flex this and flex that, and oh my gosh, I love flex, and flex is this really cool thing that you can only do with fountain pens. And almost every reviewer would do the little figure eights, and they'd put some downward pressure on the downstroke of the nib to show you how flexible it was or wasn't. And so when I started doing reviews, I, like many people, followed what was already out there. I followed that as though that were part of the prescribed format. And I still do it in my videos, but not as much, and I'll get to that in a second. Part of the problem with including that in a review is it gives the false impression that we are putting more pressure on the nib than we should. And part of the reason I say that is because, sorry, my power strip's about to fall off the desk there. Part of the reason why we say that is because it's hard to convey the amount of downward pressure we're putting on a nib. So a lot of times when I do that figure eight thing on my reviews, on the downstrokes I am putting pressure on it, but almost every nib will tell you this is the edge of where you can push. You push any more, you're going to bend something permanently. You're going to, as we call it, spring the nib. And every nib has a different point. The more you use fountain pens, the more you get to recognize when I say feedback, I don't mean feedback in the how does it feel on the paper. I mean the metal itself is actually going to say. So if you picture a pressure curve, it's slow, and then you get to this pivot point right here, and then it shoots way up, and then you hit the top of that arc here, and then it goes way down. And so what's happening is you put a little bit of pressure, you're going to get a little bit of spread, a little pressure, a little bit of spread, and then you hit this pivot point. And in order to spread it anymore, you have to push really hard. Anywhere on that curve, it's a pretty sharp curve going up. You're still okay, but as soon as you hit the top of that curve, you've sprung the nib. And then any additional pressure beyond that, you don't need much pressure to spread the tines further because you've sprung the nib, you've bent it out of place, and now you're not going against the alignment of the metal, you're going with the alignment of the metal because you've realigned the metal in the process. A good reviewer, if they're going to show this, can tell on the nib before it hits that pivot point where you have to apply a lot more pressure. Now, I've done that where I've gotten to the pivot point and gone past it and sprung the nib. I've never done it in a review video, but I have done it in real life. And I did it on an 18 karat gold nib. It was the nib on my Danny Trio. It was also done to the nib on my Pilot Vanishing Point, which was also an 18 karat gold. I don't remember if it was 18 karat or 14 karat gold off the top of my head. So when we do that in the reviews, it's hard for us to say, hey, I know what we're actually trying to show, but it doesn't convey very well is, if I push it to the edge of where it's going to start causing damage, this is how much line variation you can get. I have, over the years, become less enamored of doing that, and so I don't even, if we're going up that curve where it shoots up, I only go about halfway up that curve to the pivot point. I used to take it all the way to the pivot point to try to show you exactly how much line variation you could squeeze out of the nib if you pushed it. Now, I'm not a big fan of doing that anymore, and there are a couple of reasons why. The first is that some nibs don't give good feedback. The metal doesn't give you good feedback, and so it's easy to go past that point. And if you do that, you will damage the nib. The second reason is, and I try to mention this in most of my videos, if a nib wasn't meant to be flexed, it's stupid to try to flex the nib, and I'm just as guilty of this as anybody else. But if the nib was not designed as a flex nib, don't try to flex it. That's not what it's for. If you want to flex a pen, get a flex nib. That's what it's for. So I will do a little bit of pressure, but I'm only taking it between a third and a halfway up that initial curve. I try not to do it at all on 18 karat gold or higher nibs. On 14 karat gold nibs, I will do a little bit of that just to show you the variation. I'll take it a little bit further because 14 karat gold has enough other metals in the alloy that it will snap back most of the time. 18 karat gold and up tends to get so soft, and there aren't enough other metals in the alloy that you get that snap back. It's also the reason why those nibmeisters like John Mottishaw, who will add flex to a nib if you ask them to, will only add flex to a 14 karat gold nib and not an 18 karat gold or a 21 karat gold nib or anything like that. So why do we do it? I think we do it because people want it, and in a large part because it's just the way it's been done up to this point. It's not really the best way to do it, and there's really no good way to try to communicate what we're trying to communicate without going super in depth, which is why I've pulled back on it and I don't push my nibs anywhere near as hard as I've used to, because it's not only my own pen I worry about, but I worry about other people doing the same thing. And I feel like I've got enough experience now where I can tell either the nib is going to give me the feedback I need and I'm going to be able to recognize it to know I can't push this anymore, or it's not going to give me the feedback, and I recognize that early on. Like if I don't really push my titanium nibs very hard because titanium doesn't give good feedback on, hey, you're stressing the metal, you're stressing the metal. So that's one where I don't push those nibs very much because they don't give very good feedback. So why do we do it? Yeah, it's kind of, it's not a great thing. I wish we could kind of as reviewers, get out of the habit of doing it a little bit more. I've tried to, but it's also so ingrained in my review process. Sometimes I start doing it without even really realizing I've done it, and that's something I'm going to try to pull back a little bit more and just say, here's what it looks like with a tiny little bit of downward pressure, so you can see if you can get a little extra ink flow out of it. So there you go. All right, that was a long answer, and as soon as I start drawing graphs in the air, that's when it's probably time to move on. So this next series of questions comes from Mrigank in Hyderabad, who asks, is the cost of ink directly proportionate to its performance? Nope. There are inks that are very expensive that don't perform well, and inks that are very inexpensive that perform well. So cost and performance, there's no direct correlation, nor is performance subjective enough that you get the same performance in every pen or for every user. So there's really no way to determine. A lot of the pricing is around the branding and the bottles and the packaging, but also the dyes and chemicals and research that goes into making the nibs or making the pens. And there are a lot of other external cost factors. So if it's coming from a large company, chances are it's going to be more expensive simply because they have a larger operation that they have to support. They've got a lot more employees, and they're not doing it out of their house. They have an office building and a factory and a warehouse and shipping and duties and all of that stuff. So that is a big reason why prices will vary. That, and people just say, hey, we want to have a luxury brand, so we're going to charge a lot for this ink. Second part of the question, I know you consider blue inks boring. Not all blue inks, just some of them. But what are the most underrated blue inks in your opinion? So I don't really love the term underrated or overrated, because all that really means is you have a different opinion than me. And so, I feel like those are loaded terms and used far too often, but that's semantics, and we don't need to go down that road too much. Inks that don't get maybe as much attention as they should. I think one in my collection that I like a lot that doesn't get as much attention as it ought to is De Atramentis Indigo Blue. This is a really neat dark blue ink. It's almost a blue-black, but it's more just like a really dark blue, and it's nice. I like it a lot. Other blue inks that don't get a lot of attention. I don't have a ton of blue inks that don't get a lot of attention. I'll tell you the ones that I do like. I like really saturated blues. I mentioned earlier, my favorite is Sailor Bungbach's Sapphire, which I just love. Same thing with Ackermann Shocking Blue, Diamine Majestic Blue, all of which I own. And then I tend to move more toward the lighter blues and the turquoises than just plain blues. So but if you're looking for more like the blue blacks, I really like Shinkai. I love Pelikan Edelstein Tanzanite. I feel like that is one that doesn't get as much attention as it ought to. I'm just trying to think, are there other blues? Yeah, those are some of my favorites. I'll tell you the one that surprised me that I don't think gets talked about enough, and it's this Parker Quink. This is the blue-black. It's an interesting color. It's got a little bit of a teal to it, but it's not as bland as most of the safe inks I come across. It really has a little bit more character than I was expecting. And it's one of those inks that you're supposed to be able to use basically in any pen. It's supposed to be really safe. So those are some of my inks that I think are some of my most enjoyable ones. Number 3, household items that can substitute for micromesh. So I have heard of 3. I've never tried any of them. I speak not at all from a position of knowledge or authority, just passing on information. So I have heard, well, obviously you know that a lot of people use those emery boards, those nail files where it's pink on one side and black and white on the other side. I don't use those because I prefer the sheets of micromesh. I like the way they tend to wrap around my nib a little bit more, so I tend to use those instead. I have also heard that you can use either a piece of glass or a brown paper grocery bag, and both of those will help smooth nibs. I've heard that from several people. Never tried it, never really wanted to try it, especially the grocery bag thing. I'm sure it works. I bet it just takes a whole lot longer than micromesh does. And the glass thing, the idea of rubbing the tip of my nib on glass just makes me cringe. It's like fingernails on a chalkboard. So if anyone else has tried that and it works well, you can leave comments, or if you have other things that you use for your micromesh substitutes, by all means, put them in the comments below, but I've not tried any of those. Let's grab another pen to take a look at. So the next pen I want to re-review is the Conway Stewart 24 in the green hatched casing. So this was one of my very first eBay fountain pen experiences. I don't know why I keep doing this. It's not like I'm conducting music or something. This is the stylus to my Surface tablet that I've got here in front of me where I'm reading all my questions. So this was a pen I saw a picture of online and just fell in love with the material. Didn't know much about the Conway Stewart brand at the time. I ended up buying it. The material was gorgeous. The pen was a little dingy and it needed to be repaired. It needed a new sack. So I took the pen apart. It was my first repair ever of a vintage pen. Took the pen apart, got some new sacks, learned how to put it all back together again. The thing that I loved about this pen was it came with the most glorious, juicy, oblique, broad nib. And it was not an oblique italic. It was like an oblique, very rounded stub. It was just butter. It was gorgeous pen to write with. Unfortunately, it was also really small for my hands. And as much as I liked the pen, I found myself not inking it up very much because it wasn't very comfortable for me to use. And so I ended up selling it. I regret selling it a little bit simply because I love the material. It's one of those that I would love to just have in my collection and look at and maybe ink up to play around with every now and again. But I just couldn't justify taking this gorgeous pen and leaving it in a box unused. It needed a home, someone who would really appreciate it. So unfortunately, I rehomed it. Wah, wah. All right, we're running long, I think. I did have to interrupt the middle of my video for a phone call, so I'm not exactly sure how long we're running at the moment, but let's maybe grab another question or two and then wrap up for this episode. This next question comes from Neil in Carrollton, Georgia, who said, would you be willing to share your music you wrote for the theme of the show? I would love to play it if you have it scored. I've gotten a lot of requests for this. I don't have it scored. It is all in my head and it's different every single time I play it. So every time I sit down to write a new variation of the Pen Habit theme, it's completely different because I can never remember exactly how I played it the previous time. I've had a lot of people ask me for it. It's only about 30 seconds long. So it's kind of, you know, they've either asked me for the recorded version. It's like, I don't really want to put it out. So I may make it available as a free download on penhabit.com or something like that at some point. I probably won't ever score it because I hate scoring piano music. Hate it with the deep and fiery passion of 1,000 suns. I hate it. I love to sit down and play, and I can play from chord symbols and stuff like that. I can sight read, I can read music, no problem. I just hate writing it. I've got, the Surface tablet, and there's this really cool app for scoring music on the tablet, which I've been using, and I like that a little bit more. So maybe at some point I'll get around to it, but I'm going to have to get through my backlog of videos. So maybe that's something I'll do during the hiatus this coming summer. All right, one last question, and then I'm going to call it good for this episode. So this next question comes from Ruben in Belgium, who asks, I know you only talk about fountain pens, but what about a roller ball or ballpoint? Do you have any recommendations on a classy ballpoint or roller ball, and could you shortly explain the difference between them? There's a reason I don't talk about roller balls or ballpoints, because I don't use them. I don't enjoy them very much. They're not, for me, using if I'm going to use a pen, that is an analog experience. And like many aspects of my life, I would rather just have the best. I don't see the point in dealing with a suboptimal, what I consider to be a suboptimal option. So there's a reason why I don't use roller balls and ballpoints. If I don't have my fountain pens, I use my computer. Fountain pens are such a pleasurable experience for me. I don't see the value. And I'm not saying there isn't value, there just isn't value in it for me. So can I recommend a classy ballpoint or rollerball? I cannot, unfortunately. I am sorry. I don't use them. I have a couple in my house and I use them only when I have to fill out like a triplicate form, and that's it. And I don't carry them with me. I don't keep any at my desk, and the ones I have are just cheap uniball type things. I don't care about them. I don't look them out, search for them. I don't use them. So I will be absolutely no help. For information about roller balls and ballpoints, check out the penaddict.com blog and podcast, and Gentleman Stationer, which is another blog. I know they both do reviews of ballpoints. Anna at Well Appointed Desk probably does as well. It's not something I'm interested in, and probably not something I will ever pick up. So Sorry. Okay, that will do it for this episode of Currently Inked. Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it, as I always do. It's good to have you here, and we will see you next time. Before we sign off, though, another quick thank you to Karis Customs for sponsoring this episode. I'd like to welcome them on as new sponsors of the Pen Habit, so thank you so much, guys. You can find a link to their website on penhabit.com in the sponsor section, or just go to kariscustoms.com. Don't forget to use the coupon code KarisPens for the remainder of 2016 to get 10% off your order. So thank you so much for watching, and we will see you here next time on The Pen Habit. Bye.